Good day everyone, we are the group 3 and we will be discussing the role of the linguistic environment.
So let's move on to the role of linguistic environment in adult input. So language acquisition as a complex feat. Language acquisition is an extraordinary cognitive achievement as emphasized by Leonard Bloomfield. So Leonard Bloomfield describes language acquisition as one of the most significant intellectual challenges. This highlights that learning language is not a simple task for children but a complex cognitive process. It requires considerable effort and is fundamental to human development. So, the importance of linguistic input. While children can develop basic language systems, example home signs among deaf children, they require a rich linguistic environment to fully develop mature language skills. So, although children can invent simple forms of communication, such as home signs in deaf children who have limited exposure to formal language, they still need a rich language environment to fully acquire a mature language. This implies that social and linguistic interaction with adults is crucial for comprehensive language development. Parameter setting models. These models suggest that children use linguistic input to understand and apply the rules and parameters of their language. So, according to parameter setting models, children use the linguistic input they receive to infer the grammatical rules and settings specific to their language. For example, they might learn how to form sentences or use their senses by processing the language they hear. This theory suggests that children are active learners, turning into the specific parameters of their language based on input. So, adult input's critical role. Behaviorist views and some modern theories highlight the significant role of adult language and feedback in shaping a child's linguistic development. So, behaviorists and some modern approaches emphasize the importance of adult feedback in shaping language development. So, these theories suggest that children learn language primarily through imitation and reinforcements from adults. For example, an adult correct a child's pronunciation or grammatical mistakes, reinforcing correct forms of speech. Lastly is the limitations of behaviorism. Despite the emphasis on adult input, most experts now agree that language acquisition is more complex than what behaviorist or general learning models can explain. While behaviorism underscores the role of adult input and feedback, it has limitation in fully explaining language acquisition. Many linguists and psychologists believe that language is a complex cognitive system which cannot be solely accounted for behaviorist principle. The process of learning language involves more than just imitation and reinforcement, and it includes internal cognitive mechanisms that are not easily explained by behaviorist models. And that would be all for my part. Thank you everyone for listening.
Good day, everyone. My name is Apple Tulibas, and I am one of the assigned reporter together with Brian Bodai to discuss the role of imitation reinforcement and analogy. This is the example of the child having conversation with adult. Child, my teacher holded the baby rabbits and we patted them. Adult, did you say your teacher held the baby rabbits? Child, yes. Adult, what did you say she did? Child, she holded the baby rabbits and we patted them. Adult, did you say she held them tightly? Child, no, she held them loosely. Now we will proceed to our topic. A common misconception about language acquisition is that children simply listen to what is said around them and imitate that speech they hear. Imitation is involved to some extent, of course. An American child hears milk and a Mexican child leche, and each child attempts to reproduce what he hears. Like, for instance, a kid learning to talk by listening to people around them. When a little American kid hears someone say milk, they try to say the same word milk. Now, if a little Mexican kid hears someone say leche, they try to say leche. But here's the thing, learning to talk isn't just about copying words like a parrot. Kids don't just repeat what they hear exactly, they also start understanding the meaning of words. They won't just say milk or leche because they hear that, but because they connect it to the things that in front of them, like a glass of milk. So while kids do copy words, they're also learning the meanings and rules of their language at the same time. But children early words and sentences shows that they are not simply imitating adult speech. Children use inflectional and derivational processes to produce novel words, and their early sentences diverge from the language of their environment in systematic and interesting way. So just like what I said earlier, that when children learn to talk, they don't just copy what they hear from people around them. They also make their own words and sentences, which is a very good sign. They're using special rules called inflectional and derivational rules to change words or make new ones. For example, when the kids see a cat running, they might say cat running run, even though they heard the word cat before. They're mixing it with their own thoughts, like adding run to show what the cat is doing. They're not just repeating grown ups, they're also creating new ways to talk by changing words to match what the kids see and think. Moreover, even when children are trying to imitate what they hear, they are unable to produce sentences outside of the rules of their developing grammar. The following are a child's attempt to imitate something the adult has said. Adult, he's going out. Child, he go out. Adult, that's an old time train. Child, old time train. Adult Adam, say what I say. Child, where I can put them. Where can I put them? Adult. Imitation also fails to account for the fact that children who are unable to speak for neurological and sociological reasons are able to learn the language spoken to them and understand it. When they overcome their speech impairment, they immediately use the language for speaking. Since usually when kids learn to speak, they listen to the words around them and then they start using those words. Now some kids can talk at first because something in their brain or body is making it hard for them. But even though they can't talk yet, they can still understand everything people say to them. It's like they hear the words and know what they mean, even though they can't say them back yet. When they can finally talk, they start using the words they've been hearing all along. So it's not just about copying what people say, they're learning and understanding the language even if they can speak it at first. Another proposal on the behaviorist tradition is that children learn to produce correct grammatical sentences because adults positively reinforce them when they say something grammatical and negatively reinforce them by correction when they do it, as usually when they say something ungrammatical. So when we say positive reinforcement, when you do something right. And your mom or the people around you might say, great job, and then that makes you happy and you want to do it again. On the other hand, negative reinforcement is that when you missed out and then the people around you or your mom will say that you have to do it again. So that's what we call negative reinforcement. It's like learning to talk too. When you say the right words, adults give you a reward, like saying good job. But when you say something wrong, they help you fix that. Little by little, you learn the right way to say things because of the rewards and helpful correction. But studies shows that parents seldom correct their children and when they do it usually for mispronunciation or incorrect reporting for mispronuncia the ungrammatical sentence. Her curl my hair was not corrected because it of facts and not for bad grammar. When uttered, child uttered the grammatical sentence, Walt Disney comes on today. She was corrected because the television program was shown on Wednesday. So sometimes when a kid says something wrong, like calling a TV show Walt Disney comes on Tuesday when it actually comes on Wednesday, someone like their parents might tell them, no, it's on Wednesday. This is because what the kid said wasn't true. But if they said something like her curl my hair, which isn't exactly the right grammar, the parent may not correct them right away. They might not say anything because what the kid said is not about facts, it's just the way they put the words together. One researcher concluded somewhat wryly that it is truth value rather than syntactic well-formedness that chiefly governs explicit verbal reinforcement by parents, which renders mildly paradoxical the fact that the usual product of such a training schedule is an adult whose speech is highly grammatical but not notably thoughtful. Like, for instance, that when the kid talk to the parents, they will help the kid learn to speak better. They make sure they say things the right way, like using the correct words and sentences. They don't always focus on whether what they said is true. Instead, they care more about how they'll say it. So when the kid grow up and talk like an adult, they might sound very correct with their words and sentences, but sometimes even though they're speaking well, what they're saying might not always be true. It's like saying everything the right way, but not always saying the right things.
The three key aspects of children's language learning: recast and parental feedback, explicit correction of syntax, and the use of analogy. It highlights the limitations of these strategies and emphasizes the complexity of grammar acquisition. Recast and parental feedback. Parents often model correct grammar by rephrasing a child's ungrammatical sentence without explicitly pointing out the error. However, recasts are inconsistent since parents focus more on content than grammar, correcting only 25% of ungrammatical sentences, while sometimes recasting correct ones. This inconsistency may confuse children relying on recasts to learn grammar. Example: Child, I go to the park. Parent recast, oh, you went to the park. Here, the parents indirectly models the correct verb form went, but does not explain why go is wrong. The child might not internalize the rule. Explicit correction of syntax. Directly correcting a child's syntax often fails because children may not understand their errors or how to fix them. Even with repetition, the child may persist in using incorrect grammar due to their developmental stage. Example: Child, nobody don't like me. Parent, no, say nobody likes me. Child repeating, nobody don't like me. This cycle demonstrates the difficulty of children have in applying corrections even when explicitly taught. Use of analogy in sentence formation. Children learn language partly by analogy, forming new sentences based on patterns they hear. While this helps generalize rules, it can lead to errors when the analogy does not align with English syntax rules. Examples: correcting analogy, hearing I painted a red barn and creating I painted a blue barn. Incorrect analogy, hearing I painted a barn red and forming I saw a barn red, which is ungrammatical. Avoided errors. Despite using analogy, children do not make certain syntactic errors, such as interpreting John grows tomatoes to mean John grows, as in he grows something, showing an inherent understanding of grammatical constraints. The passage explores how children use analogy in language learning and why this process is guided by their understanding of syntax. While analogy helps in generalizing grammatical rules, children avoid certain syntactic errors due to their innate grasp of grammatical principles, likely informed by universal language. Limits of analogy in language learning. Children often create new sentences by analogizing from ones they've heard. While this can work for simple structures, it fails for complex grammatical rules or word order or meaning changes. Children seem to instinctively avoid errors in these cases, showing that their grammar is not purely based on analogy. Examples: correct analogy. From one, I painted the bar ran. They learned the corresponding logical PR. I made school tense into painted barn. Pained correct.
That's all, thank you.
Good day, everyone, and good day, Sir Jeff. So, I am Garnet Rochelle, one of the reporters, and the assigned topic that given to me is the role of structured input. In most cultures, adults talk to young children in a special way. They tend to speak more slowly and more clearly. They may speak in higher pitch and exaggerated. Their annotation and sentences directed to children are generally grammatical. So infants prefer to listen to motherese over normal adult speech. Researchers believe that the exaggerated annotation and other properties may be useful for getting a child's attention and making salient certain features of language. Yet, another suggestion is that children are able to learn language because adults speak to them in a special or simplified language. It is sometimes called the motherese or child-directed speech or CDS, also known as baby talk. Motherese is a type of speech that adults use when communicating with infants and young children. The purpose of motherese is to help children learn language and understand and create sentences. It can also help communicate emotionally in formation and build an effective relationship between the adult and the child. This hypothesis also places a lot of emphasis on the role of the environment in facilitating language acquisition. Motherese, or the way adults talk to babies, isn't very simple. It includes complex sentences like questions, commands, and tag questions. So, for example, like you pat the dog gently, and the negative with tag questions is we don't want to hurt him, do we? So, adults also don't leave out important grammar parts, even though kids often do. So, research shows that using more or less motherese doesn't speed up a child's language development. Instead, adults adjust their speech as the child's language skills grow. Imitation, reinforcement, and analogy cannot account for language development because they are based on the implicit or explicit assumption that what the child acquires is a set of sentences or forms rather than a set of grammatical rules and logistic structures. So that means that imitation, reinforcement, and analogy cannot fully explain how children learn language because this focus on copying sentences, not learning grammar rules. So theories that rely too much on the environment also overlook the child's natural ability to develop a grammar. So these ideas fail to explain that children's creativity with language, the stages they go through, or why they make certain errors but not others. So, for example, a child might say it doing dancing, but never a sentence like was the boy who's sleeping is dreaming? So they also don't explain how children learn so much from limited and inconsistent input. Now, next proceed to knowing more than one language. Roger Bacon, 1214 to 1294, he that understands grammar in one language understands it in another as far as the essential properties of grammar are concerned. The fact that he can't speak nor comprehend another language is due to the diversity of words and their various forms, but these are the accidental properties of grammars. So this means that someone who understands the basic rules of grammar in one language can understand the grammar of any language since the core principles are the same. However, the inability to speak or understand another language comes from differences in vocabulary and word forms, which are less essential aspects of grammar. People can acquire a second language under many different circumstances. You may have learned a second language when you began a middle school or high school or college. Moving to a new country often means acquiring a new language. Other people live in communities or homes in which more than one language is spoken and may acquire two or more languages simultaneously. The term second language acquisition or L2 acquisition generally refers to the acquisition of a second language by someone, adult or child, who has already acquired a first language. This is also referred to as sequential bilingualism. Bilingual language acquisition refers to the more or less simultaneous acquisition of two languages beginning in infancy or before the age of 3 years, also referred to as simultaneous bilingualism. So, people learn a second language in different ways, such as at school, moving to a new country, or growing up in a bilingual home. So, usually, the second language acquisition means learning a second language after already knowing one. So, it is also called a sequential bilingualism. While learning two languages at the same time from young age or before the age of 3 is called bilingual language acquisition or simultaneous bilingualism. Now, let's proceed to the childhood bilingualism. About half of the world's population grows up speaking more than one language, especially in regions like Africa and Asia, where bilingualism or multilingualism is common. Many Western countries consider themselves monolingual, though they often host diverse language communities. In places like the US and Europe, bilingualism is often linked to immigration and seen as temporary. Bilingualism raises many questions, such as whether children confuse languages, whether learning two languages takes longer than one, and how it affects cognitive or academic growth. Early research found that bilingual children sometimes mix languages in sentences, such as combining words or using the syntax of one language in another. This mixing highlights the complexity of bilingual language acquisition. So, for example, the word his nose is perdo means his nose is lost, while a house pink means a pink house, and that's to me means that's mine. In the other two examples, all of the words are English, but the syntax is French. In early research on bilingualism viewed language mixing in children as a negative sign of confusion or difficulty handling two languages. So this often led parents, following advice from the educators or psychologists, to stop raising their child bilingually. However, it is now understood that language mixing is normal and natural part of early bilingual language development, not a sign of any problem. Various researchers have claimed that language mixing in bilingual children is similar to code switching used by many adult bilinguals. So code switching reflects the grammars of both languages working simultaneously. It is not bad grammar or broken English. Adult bilinguals code switch only when speaking to other bilingual speakers, and various studies have shown that bilingual children as young as 2 may contextually appropriate language choices in speaking to monolinguals. The children use one language, and in speaking to bilinguals they mix the two languages. This means that language mixing in bilingual children is similar to code switching, a practice used by bilingual adults where they switch between two languages within the same conversation or sentence. So for example, an adult might say, I put the forks in las mesas. So it's mixed English and Spanish. So code switching is not a sign of poor grammar or language skills. So they use only one language when speaking to monolinguals and mixed languages like adults when talking to bilinguals. So this shows that language mixing is intentional and context sensitive, not random or confusing. And now let's move on to theories of bilingual development. There is no reason to believe that the underlying principles and mechanisms of language education in bilinguals are qualitatively differed from those used by monolinguals. By Georgian Missal, Linguistics 24, 1986. Georgian Missal sentence means that the basic principles and processes involved in language learning are essentially the same for bilinguals and monolinguals. In other words, the way both groups learn and understand language is based on similar mechanisms, and there is no reason to think that bilinguals use fundamentally different methods than those used by people who speak only one language. The separate system hypothesis says that bilingual child builds a distinct lexicon and grammar for each other. Canadian bilingual children who acquire languages des signes, Quebecois or LCQ or Quebec Sign Language develop the two languages exactly like bilingual children acquiring two spoken languages. The LSQ French bilinguals reach linguistics milestone in each of their language in parallel with Canadian children acquiring French and language. So the separate system hypothesis suggests that bilingual children develop two separate language systems, one for each language. So evidence supporting these ideas shows that bilingual children follow the specific grammar rules for each language. So for example, Spanish, English, and French German bilinguals use the correct word order and grammar rules, like agreement, morphemes for each language. So they also develop distinct vocabularies and pronunciation patterns for each language. So even very young bilingual children understand which language to use in different situations. So this hypothesis is further supported by studies of children with deaf parents who learn both a sign language and a spoken language. So Canadian bilingual children who learn both languages des signes, Quebecois or LSQ, and French develop both languages in the same way as bilingual children learning two spoken languages. So they reach language milestones like producing their first words and combinations simultaneously in both languages without delays compared to monolingual children. While the LSQ French bilinguals children have equivalent words in both languages. So similar to bilinguals learning two spoken languages, These children can choose which language to use based on their conversation partner. And like many bilinguals, so they sometimes mix languages in their speech. So what's unique is that they mix LSQ signs and French words simultaneously, so which can only happen when one language is signed and the other is spoken. So uh, this shows that language mixing in bilingual children is not a sign of confusion, but rather a natural result of using two different grammar systems at the same time. Next is the bilingual children develop their two languages similarly to monolingual children, so going through stages like babbling, the holophrastic stage, and the telegraphic stage. During the telegraphic stage, bilingual children show language patterns specific to each language, further supporting the idea of separate systems. So for example, English-speaking monolingual children might omit verbs endings like Eve played there, while German-speaking English use infinitives like chocolate and forget chocolate. So Spanish and Italian-speaking children don't omit verb endings. The bilingual children also show this pattern. A 2-year-old German-Italian bilinguals use infinitives in German but not in Italian, and the Spanish-English bilinguals drop verb endings in English but not in Spanish. And similarly, German-English bilinguals omit verb inflections in English but use infinitives in German. So this suggests that bilingual children follow the grammatical rules of each language separately. So I think that's the end of my part. Thank you and have a great day.
So, native language influence in adult linked to accusation presented by me, which is Charlie Regulacion. One respect in which Link 1 accusation and Link 2 accusation are clearly different in that adult Link 2ers already have fully developed grammar of their first language. As discussed in Chapter 1, linguistic competence is unconscious knowledge. We cannot suppress our ability to use the rules of our languages. We cannot decide not to understand English. So one of the most important and fascinating aspects of human development is the language accusation. The present review summarizes some difficulties that second language learners may face to learn English. It has tried to find out factors that play an important role in the accusations of second language. It is also popular of some beliefs that the first language has a big impact or effect on the second language, and it is also believed or it is claimed that Ling 1 can interfere with the accusation of Ling 2. It also believes that the role of Ling 1 in the language 2 depends on some similarities and differences between the two languages. The present review brings to the force the similarities and differences between the first language and the second language accusation, and then concludes with some implications for teachers and researchers. The second page is the beginning of the stage. Lesson 2 seems to rely on in Ling 1 grammar to some extent. This is shown by the kinds of errors Ling 2 errors make, which often involve the transfer of grammar rules from the Ling 1. This is the most obvious in phonology. Generally speak within accents because they transfer the phonology rules and syllable structures, stress placement, or intonation patterns of their languages to their second languages. So it means that for the very beginning or for the very beginning of the stage, ang link to daw is, it seems that it is relying on the Ling 1 grammar, and because of that, Some some grammar rules daw is transfer lang siya sa linto. It involve the phonology rules, syllable structures, stress placement, o intonational pattern. It just transfer into second languages. There are some languages are the example of native languages that are adapted from the second language. First is the fato, faith, fato, fact, pala, shovel, pala, ball, dita, fingers, dita, company. Correct me if I'm wrong, if my pronunciation is correct or not, but as I researched earlier, the pronunciation that I just said or speak is, they are just the same. It's just not as prolonged. And next one is English speaking learners of Italian have difficulty in hearing and producing the contrast between long and short consonant. We also find native language influence in the syntax and morphology. Sometimes they show up as a wholesale transfer of a particular piece of grammar. A Spanish speaker acquiring English might drop subject in non-imperative sentences because it's possible in Spanish. So according to the book, or according into my report, ang mga Spanish people daw, ang mga Italian people daw is, they experience difficulty in hearing, and they cannot differentiate the long and short consonant that people could talk towards to them, and they cannot hear the long and short consonant pronunciation. And then they also transfer and it also in the native it also influenced the syntax and the morphology. So this is some example. Hey is not funny. In here have the mouth. Live in Colombia. And that is all my report. Thank you for listening.
So, good day everyone. My name is Altayemi Betanyo, the reporter of the creative component L2 accusation. So, what is a creative component L2 accusation? So, the creative component in L2 accusation or second language accusation refers to the ability of learners to use the target language in novel ways, going beyond simply memorizing and repeating structures or vocabulary they have been implicitly taught. This concept highlights the role of creativity and language learning, where learners actively experiment, hypothesize, and generate unique sentences or expressions. So here are the examples. A learner knows the word cat or table and jump. They create the sentence, the cat jumps on the table. Even though they never explicitly learned this exact sentence, they creatively combine vocabulary and grammar rules to express the idea. So, here are the another examples. A learner tries to use the past tense of go and says, I go to the store. So, this error demonstrates creativity as a learner applies the regular past tense rule ed to an irregular verb, showing an understanding of linguistic patterns. So I will give you another example. So a learner doesn't know the word raincoat and instead says, I need a rain jacket to stay dry. This creatively describe the concept using vocabulary they already know, successfully conveying their meaning despite limited knowledge. The creative component in second language acquisition refers to the learner's ability to use the target language in innovative ways to communicate ideas. Even when they have not explicitly learned certain forms or phrases, this highlights that L2 learning is not merely about memorizing vocabulary and grammar, but involves active problem solving and experimentation. Learners creatively apply grammatical rules, combine known words to form new sentences, and adapt their language use to demonstrate how learners applied they have learned. Even similarly, when lacking specific vocabulary, they might describe concepts creatively, such as saying rain jacket instead of raincoat. The creative components reflects deeper cognitive engagement with the language as learners construct meaning and test hypotheses about this structure. It also supports theories like Chomsky's universal grammar, which suggests an innate ability to generate language. Ultimately, this aspect of L2 acquisition highlights the dynamic and innovative process of learning to communicate effectively in a new language. And that is the end of my report. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I am Jakash Nislaman, and now we will proceed to discuss about the heritage language learners. But first, what is a heritage language learner? A heritage language learner is someone who grows up hearing and sometimes speaking language at home, but their main language changes later, like when they start a school. For example, a child might grow up hearing Spanish from their parents but mainly speak English outside home. Some heritage learners might know how to speak a language but can't read or write it. Now, let's talk about what happens to their language over time by learning the definition of language attrition and maintenance. Language attrition occurs when a heritage language is gradually lost, usually when a person transitions to using a dominant language, often starting when they enter school. However, language maintenance can happen if the heritage language continues to be used at home or in the community. Factors like consistent usage and parents' positive attitudes toward the language and culture significantly influence whether the heritage language is retained. Now, let's think about how age affects language learning. Well, research shows that the younger someone is when they start learning a second language, the better they'll likely become at it. For example, kids who start learning another language between ages 3 and 8 can often sound like native speakers. But as people get older, it becomes harder to learn certain parts of a language, like pronunciation. This idea is called a sensitive period, and it shows why early exposure to a second language is so important. Learning a second language doesn't just affect how we speak, it also changes our brains. Studies show that bilingual people have denser brain areas related to language compared to monolinguals. This means that learning a second language, especially early in life, can improve things like memory, problem solving, and even creativity. Now, let's talk about how bilingual children learn two languages. There is something called the separate systems hypothesis, which says that bilingual kids keep their two languages separate. For example, they learn the grammar and vocabulary of each language independently and use the right language in the right situation. Studies also show that bilingual kids aren't confused by having two languages. Instead, they are really good at switching between them depending on who they're talking to or where they are. This actually makes them more flexible thinkers. That would be the end of our discussion for today. So, thank you for listening. I hope this video gave you a better understanding of language learners and why learning them matters.